AI leaders. Why do we need them? How do you become one? And above all, how do you keep your job as one? Today, we're going to find out. My name is Kjell Carlsson, head of AI strategy at Domino, and we are extremely fortunate to have with us my former partner in crime, Mike Gualtieri, VP, principal analyst at Forrester, and probably at least one of the industry analysts, if not the industry analyst, who has been looking at and covering the AI and machine learning space longer than everyone else. Mike, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, Kjell, it's great to be here and great to be talking with you again.
Wonderful. Well, let's talk about leadership. I mean, we talk about all of the things that are important when it comes to driving impact with machine learning and AI. We talk about data. We talk about data scientists, data engineers, occasionally developers. We should be talking about them a lot more. But where do leaders fit into all of this? How important are they? Are they missing? Do we have them? Do we need more of them?
I do think you need special type of leadership for AI. And I mean, you need general leadership skills, but when we think about AI specifically, I love to say or remind people that AI is software in the end, right? So you were kind of touching on it, right? You definitely need data scientists, data engineers. You know, this is a technology that comes from data, but it also manifests itself in business value as software, right? So at some point, the data science lifecycle needs to intersect with the software development lifecycle and the IT ops. So the point here is that you should think about AI as a special type of software, and the leadership qualities are ideal if that leader has experience in software delivery. So I think those are the main characteristics to look for. If you, for example, elevate a data scientist to that position, they probably surely have software development experience, but it's probably focused on training models, building models. It may not be focused on, well, then how do you create a scalable system for APIs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think leadership experience that touches on software, but also is strong in data, is most important.
Oh, absolutely. I'm curious because, I mean, if you were to go back about 15 to 20 years ago, that would have been an entirely alien concept, I think, to folks, both on the data science side of things and analytics generally. And I'm wondering whether it's because, again, if you go back 15, 20 years ago, people were thinking about insights. They were thinking about, well, this is about creating great visualizations, great analyses, going in and finding out what's happened and making recommendations around it, versus we've been, and still important, but we've been migrating more and more towards an output for a data scientist, an outcome of these projects, which is a model embedded in software, many models embedded in an application that is driven by data, AI, and machine learning that is going on and driving ongoing value. And so it's like the impact that we're looking to drive, the scalable impact, is really through these applications versus in going and creating these more ad hoc insights.
Right. Yeah. It becomes a software component. It becomes a specialized software component. And the other thing I didn't mention, which also emphasizes the importance of having a software delivery experience, is a lot of the GenAI models, you're not doing data science at all. You're using, you're not building or training models. In that case, you may be using a model. You may, which may be calling an API on Azure, AWS.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably better to think about it as in that you are building an AI product, or you're building a product that is leveraging generative AI. And I guess when I talk to folks about this who are just getting started, there's a certain naivety around just how easy that would be. It's like, great, all I need to do is the prompt engineering, maybe at most some RAG, I'll call the model, and it'll be done. And almost invariably what I'm finding is that it's never that easy. It's actually a huge amount of trial and error, creating these complicated pipelines. And what you end up building is new in the data science realm, but it's well understood in terms of building a data product. And then when you go to the software developer teams, what I hear is that this is quite new to them. They're not used to this amount of trial and error, this amount of experimentation on the data discovery side, on the use case side, and on the getting all of these often emerging components to work. But curious whether or not you're seeing that folks have cracked this. That there are, like, a traditional software developer team has come in and been able to actually build one of these without having to go in and actually sort of teach themselves a good amount of data science and a lot of data products along the way.
You mean using like GenAI models that are pre-built?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, well, you're using a pre-built GenAI model, but it turns out you actually need to know an awful lot about the data and evaluating different generative AI models and going in and how to constrain the outcomes, the output of a generative AI model. And before you know it, you've had to replicate a lot of what data scientists end up spending most of their time on.
Right. Or you swapped out a model. It's like, we're going to download Llama 2 and use that instead of, and then all your prompts don't work. It has different results. So yeah, and that's why I think there's also landmines, for a leader that comes from either background, because they may be naive in the opposite area. And it's also where they get advice from, right? Because as a leader, you may have people in your organization. I've seen this a million times, Kjell, where a leader who's maybe at a higher level, and that's what we're talking about with the AI leader, they may be taking advice for someone who talks like they know what they're talking about, but they don't know what they're talking about. So all the decisions get made by, I'm going to call that person the know-it-all loudmouth. So because they appear to know everything about a certain subject, and they're very articulate, like an AI model, so you believe it. But as an AI leader, you have to make sure that you're not the subject of hallucinations from, the wrong information source. So, it's just like if you're trying to learn something, you don't go to the first YouTube video, watch it, and say, oh, okay, I got this. I mean, you got to watch several before you kind of figure it out. So I think, leaders need to be, I don't know if humble is the word, but they need to be confident. Yeah, skeptical. They need to be confident in what they know, but they have to constantly seek another source, because just because something sounds like it makes sense doesn't mean it's the way to go. One of the things there is a thing I would recommend to a leader: don't build it automatically, right? Because, we can build this beautiful model that's going to achieve accounts payable. We can predict who's going to pay, that sort of thing. Well, you should look at your business software roadmap. They may have that coming. So, so the whole subject of prioritizing your use cases, that's also the leader's responsibility. Because imagine being a leader, it's like, look at this. We just spent 8 months doing this beautiful, new model. And then the next version of Oracle comes out and it just has it as a feature, included.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, what you're saying is that this role also needs to be a business leader. They need to be outcomes oriented. They need to know what the KPIs of the organization are and what's going on in the rest of the organization and align this. So they need to be part business leader. They need to be part data science and analytics leader, and part application development leader, and merge that into, or be at least the bridge between all three of those things.
And Kjell, this conversation kind of harkens back to like the digital transformation leader too, right? Which is kind of like, we've got this new special thing, and therefore we need a new special leader. And I think AI is like that. And the question is this like a super long-term role for the next 10 years, or is it a temporary role? I mean, it doesn't matter, because I believe it's a necessary role now. But at some point, AI needs to become part of the entire pulse of the business.
Yes, I mean, arguably the digital transformation leader right now is the AI leader. It's sort of the latest incarnation. It's the best hope for a lot of organizations to be able to execute that digital transformation or get that next boost there.
Yes, but Kjell, I also fear that by me mentioning digital transformation, we've just had half the people drop off this podcast because that term is just like,
Well, I think a lot of them will know that that's what they're being tasked to do. Versus if you were a CDO, you could come in, you shouldn't have, but you could have come in with the view that, well, my role is going to be about data governance and data management. If you're a chief analytics officer, you could have come in with the view that, okay, well, what I'm supposed to be doing is in charge of business intelligence and reporting. With this up leveling of all of these different roles into an AI leader, whether that be a chief AI officer or whether it just be a redefined chief analytics officer, a CDO, CDAO role, I think there is explicit in there, or implicit or explicit, that this person needs to be going and driving transformation in the organization. Otherwise,
actually, I love that point. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Whatever that specialized role is, it has to have those business qualities. So, yeah, because maybe that's the summary. If you're an AI leader, you're not just focusing on AI, but to be successful, you have to be a business leader who's also savvy about technology, but not just AI technology, the entire portfolio.
Well, I worry that the audience hears that and they're like, oh, crap. I remember what's happened to the last digital transformation officer and what's happened with those initiatives before, right? Under-resourced, high flying expectations, and 2 years down the road, we didn't have anything and we got rid of it and we abandoned the team. How do I make sure that doesn't happen to my team? Because that sounds really, really similar. I think, especially with all of the hype and excitement around generative AI, it's like wonderful, great. There's enthusiasm and interest, and there's a willingness to change and participate like never before. But I think the folks who've been doing this for a little bit are looking 6 months, 12 months down the road, and are thinking, oh, but how are we actually going to deliver on this? How am I going to have something to show for it at the end? And they're going to be expecting something GenAI. GenAI is probably going to have to be in the mix because we've been talking about GenAI. And if I focus all of my attention on traditional predictive modeling and other things that, we know how to do and we've already been driving value on, but there's no GenAI in this, then people are going to say, well, so you didn't do any quote unquote AI, according to that definition. And so you didn't do your job.
I think you have to say yes to what people insist that they want, but always deliver what they actually need. That may sound a little bit deceptive, but your job's on the line, right? So, there's many executives who are insistent on Gen AI, right? But you may have a use case that has a predictive model that's like, whoa, right? So maybe you could find a way to incorporate Gen AI into it, but nothing matters except for some sort of business outcome. So if someone tells you to bang your head against the wall, say, okay, yeah, I'll do that, but actually don't do it. And do an AI project that you can point to that has business success, because you're not going to get fired for that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing there is I feel like you kind of need to have a portfolio-based approach to it. And so you need to have something in there which is shiny and AI linked. Otherwise, I just remember too frequently when folks were supposed to be going after advanced analytics, again, 10, 15 years ago, and got appointed to be driving advanced analytics. And it was just so much easier to drive actual outcomes with business intelligence. So they just focused all on reporting and improving reporting, and they delivered value, but they then became BI leaders versus going in and becoming more than that. It sort of absorbed all their time.
So there's a risk. I guess there's a risk reward then, right? To take on the bigger as a leader, right? It's like what are you going to personally invest in for the organization and for your further career? Because there's going to be a risk reward to that. Do you want to go for some big transformative project that's more risky to implement, or the use cases will work. So I love your notion of a portfolio. So thinking of it that way, like some use cases that are slam dunks, and then others that are more longer term.
Yeah, well, you're making me think that there's also value in describing it as a journey and going in and say, okay, I'm going to focus on these use cases right now where I can deliver value right now. And we're going to get to those other capabilities after we have delivered success here, because that's going to enable us to go and get the buy-in, build out those capabilities, and that's going to enable me to deliver that product that you think is really, really cool and exciting, that we all think is really, really cool and exciting, but we can't get to that right now. We're just not mature enough.
Well, yeah,
that
reminds me of some phrases that I'm not that fond of, but are very common, like baby steps, or walk before you run. Those are all expectation setting steps that, are very common at a very large organization, at many large organizations. But it's also, it's probably uncommon to say, I'm not taking baby steps. I'm taking giant steps. I'm not going to walk before I run. I'm just going to start running. Right. So, and I think that's kind of speaks to the risk profile and the expectations you set. And, the AI leader has to kind of measure what is going to work in their organization.
Well, I don't know. With GenAI, it feels like folks are increasingly going in and saying that I'm going to take those jumps. I mean, I feel like I've talked to organizations where they've come in with a view that, oh, okay, I am going to go and outsource a lot of my customer service operations straight off the bat, because can't I do that now with I've got a developer team, I've got the business users, and I've got a third party LLM, so I can do that, right? So I guess I'm curious the degree that, I mean, the sensible AI leader knows not to do that, but he's probably surrounded by other business leaders who aren't quite as savvy about that.
Yeah, no, I think they're going to have to be incredibly flexible, just because of the velocity of AI and what's happening and the changes and what's possible. So you may be going down one path, but you may have to change that very much quicker than you normally would with another technology. Because even if you think of like things about GenAI when they first came out, like, oh, you're never going to develop your own model, it's too expensive. OpenAI spent X, Y, and Z, right? But there's open source models, there's fine tuning, there's RAG. But there are organizations building models. You don't need to do what OpenAI did. You don't need Shakespeare's sonnets as training data set, or the lyrics of AC/DC as your training set for certain use cases. So the data set could be a lot smaller too. So I've even seen views like that changing too, where people said there's no way we're ever going to build our own GenAI model, to companies thinking about it and saying maybe.
Yes, and I'm reminded of a project that I saw over at the Army, where they were going in and fine-tuning an open source model to go in and learn military jargon, because you can only imagine the difference between what acquiring an asset means for the Army versus what it means in so many other contexts. So there are those use cases, quite a lot of use cases, where all of a sudden you discover that there's a degree of specialization that you need to undertake. I guess the other thing that I'm seeing is folks going in and pulling that specialization out of the model. So you're doing predictive modeling for doing case classification, or predictive modeling for doing next best action with a traditional predictive model, and then you're leveraging the large language model for what it's good at, which is going in and providing the language, the conversation around, the verbiage around all of this. And so there's an interesting decomposition that's happening there.
Yeah, the articulation of, and that's why RAG is so successful in some use cases, because you're taking your information, giving to it, and it's great at articulating that back.
I've often heard people talk about this AI leader role as being an air traffic controller. Indeed, folks were referring to this when it comes to the CDAO role and CAO role previously. They want to be more in the role of guiding the ongoing initiatives that are happening, that are growing from a grassroots level around the organization. And I think the role definitely has to have that component of that. I don't think they can abdicate that responsibility. Somebody needs to be in that role of directing, making sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction, that they're not duplicating efforts, and that they are investing in shared capabilities. But do you feel that that's enough? Or does this role need to be a lot more hands-on and actually own a portfolio of their own projects to be running?
I think they need to own a portfolio. I mean, different organizations are going to be different, but there's too much sprawl in a lot of these projects. And if the AI, if as an AI leader, you're going to have your annual review with whoever your boss is, and they're going to say, you know, what have we done with AI? I mean, yeah, you could be very successful with a distributed air traffic controller role because, you know, you're landing planes. You know, a few of them crash, but, you know, that's fine. It's AI. But if you own some of your own projects, you know, you're going to have a lot more control over if they're successful. But having said that, maybe you need to understand what type of leader you are. Right? Because if you're coming more, if your strength is actually as an air traffic controller, well, maybe you should leverage that. But if you are coming from a more technical background, data science, software development, maybe you should have a portfolio of projects as well. Now, Kjell, in some large organizations, right, there's a lot of experimentation going on as well, like life sciences. Or even financial services, right? So there's some operational projects that are just the normal course of the business, but there's some experimental. So you also have to think about, you know, who owns those, because a lot of times there's a research leader that may own that. So, but the other thing a leader can do, and you know this quite well, I cover AI ML platforms. So a lot of the inquiries I get from AI leaders, they want to understand the platform market because, you know, their organization has like a chaotic data science environment. They've got a little open source here, some stuff here. They've got many things, and they're looking to kind of unify that. So if you think about this idea of the air traffic controller, you need an air traffic control system so that everyone so that you can control it.
Well, to a certain extent, it sounds like, extending the metaphor, to a certain extent, you need to build the airport. That a lot of these capabilities that are there aren't there, or they're very distributed. They're all going in different directions. It's very inefficient. They're not getting scale. They're not going and investing in the capabilities that they need to. Part of your role, yes, is in directing the activities of everyone else, but it sounds like part of your role is also building up the capabilities of the organization.
Did you use this airport thing? Because, you know, I have 3 patents in air traffic control expert system.
I had forgotten about those. You did tell me about those.
Yeah. That was AI a long time ago. It was more based upon knowledge-based systems, expert systems. But yeah, so I think... but I do like the analogy of building the airport and the infrastructure for it as well, because that also is another way you can be successful in your air traffic control role.
Well, to a certain extent, if you don't have it, I guess there's a limit to just how successful you could be in terms of if we can't fly the planes and we don't have the planes, then how are we going to be able to go in and transport these passengers?
And this is completely what happened with software development. You know, if you go back 30 years or however many years, or then web, right? You had, you know, it was so new, it became chaotic. We needed to bring order to it. And platforms emerged, and leadership emerged, and organizations emerged within enterprises to deal with it.
Well, now you're making me recognize yet another way that we can extend the metaphor, which is one around safety, and sort of what ensures that we can transport people effectively. It's because it's safe enough. If it was as dangerous as it was during the Wright brothers' time, you know, we wouldn't be getting anybody anywhere. Nobody would be able to fly. And so responsible AI is a huge topic right now. Would love your thoughts on what the AI leaders should be doing when it comes to responsible AI.
Well,
well, so clearly they should be going in and creating principles that are specifically for AI that clearly we're not doing for the rest of the organization, and everything will take care of itself. No, sorry, I couldn't resist.
Well, I mean, we probably shouldn't go with my first thought, which is because it's kind of complex. But there's the Gen AI part of this, and then there's the predictive, right? Because there's different, Gen AI. You're dealing with hallucinations and there's other issues than the predictive model. But generally, it's a little bit odd to me that people want to have responsible AI because it's the same. You want everything to be responsible. Don't you want responsible software? Don't you want a responsible business practice? So, there's part of me that's saying, why is everyone picking on AI? So I'm just saying that. Okay.
Well, I love the idea that we have principles of fairness for AI because clearly we don't hold those principles anywhere else in the organization, right? I mean, we don't want everything else we do to be accountable. We don't want it to be fair. We don't want it to be transparent and all the rest of those things.
Wow.
I mean, if you
just changed my thinking on this. That it's like, at least we have it for AI. Okay.
I guess there would be that one, but it's more like the organization has principles already. If your AI principles are in conflict with your organizational principles, you're going to have a really hard time shifting the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. But given that, the advice that I always give people who maybe don't understand the weeds of responsible AI, as I always tell them, you don't have to do what the model tells you to do. Like, you don't have to use it, right? So for example, if you have a model that's, making a loan prediction, predicting whether or not to approve a loan, you actually don't have to use the model output if you don't want to. Like, you can look at the application and variables on the application. You can say, given these variables, actually, I think I'll have a human do this. And it's kind of similar with Gen AI. I mean, the practicality of how you actually examine the output, but a lot of people on the Gen AI, they're using guard models. And I'm not saying that those are perfect, right? But it's like, okay, well, here's an output. And now we're going to examine the output to see if we want to use it or not. And I mean, there's many, many more techniques that you're aware of, Shapley additive values, et cetera, for predictive models. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about why do I trust flying? Why am I okay going into an airplane? And so, it's got the statistics on terms of air traffic safety is pretty good, but when I think about it, it's certainly not because I go in and trust the ethical principles of American Airlines and Delta and all the other ones. They're great, but the key reason why, I trust the pilots, that they've been trained to go in and fly the plane accordingly. I trust the process that they have to go through to do pre-flight checks to go in and inspect all of the aircraft. I mostly trust that the aircraft was built in according to the right specifications, that the metals and components that went into it were tested and were sourced correctly. There are all of these things that go into me being willing to trust the plane. And when I think about trusting in either a machine learning model, a generative AI model, and above all, an application which is leveraging these, I would trust that a lot more if I knew that the data had been validated, that the models had been rigorously tested, that the application had been tested, that the models are being monitored for drift, that there's a continuous improvement process, that there's the equivalent of a black box for the model. Instead of like, when the models fail, can you go back and reproduce what caused it and fixed all of those things? So when I think about that trust and think about responsible AI from the point of view of generating trust and minimizing risk, so much of it would be in creating the processes and managing that process. And I'm wondering whether or not is the AI leader responsible for that too?
Well, I mean, this brings me right back to AI platforms and the vendors who have AI platforms, your company included, where that brings order and consistency to all of the processes, right? If you look at the life cycle of the data, I mean, there's practices that are important as well, but many times the platform kind of enforces the practices to a large extent.
If done well, right? Yeah. If it can automate or streamline, or as you can say, enforce the process and the practices, then, I mean, as human beings, we don't like doing manual, repetitive things in the best of times. I mean, we just look at how resistant surgeons were to go in and use checklists, right? I mean, how hard is it to go in and count all of the things that you did use during your surgery? Well, it's not something as human beings we like doing. So to the degree that we can use technology to go in and do a lot of that for us or force us to do it, I guess we're probably going to do it.
I remember a few years ago, pre-GenAI, explainability was a very, how do we do model explainability? And there were all practices and techniques for doing that. And I used to say, well, okay, after the hundreds of people I've talked to about this, asking inquiries, there seemed to be two types. There were the people worried about explainability weren't doing it. And the people who weren't worried about it already had a platform or were doing it. So it wasn't that it was a challenge. I would simply say, oh, you're concerned about explainability? Use explainability techniques, right? Now that's kind of taken for granted in a platform because the techniques are embedded in the platform. And in many cases, you don't even have to understand how it works because it's going to do it for you.
Yes. I guess I'm now, I can't get off of this airport and flying analogy. And I'm thinking I don't need to. The reason why I trust that I'm going to get over to San Francisco safely isn't because I have explainability as to on why the plane flies. I'm not given a brochure when I get on the plane which says, okay, this is the way that the plane flies and how it gets there. I don't worry about that because I trust that the folks who've been building the plane have gone in and used those techniques in order to build the plane effectively, and that has all been baked into the process and is in the skill knowledge of the people who built the plane. Now, obviously, if the plane occasionally didn't fly and did fly, and I occasionally crashed, then obviously all of a sudden I really want a lot of explainability, and then we do forensic investigations when that happens. But hoping that explainability will be enough to go in and drive everything and provide trust and ensure responsible usage feels like that's unrealistic expectations for what is a simple tool or a simple set of tools that you use on an ongoing basis, but not the be all and end all. Yeah.
Did you know I was in a plane crash, Kjell?
I did not know that. I'm sorry to hear that.
I was on Aero Peru. In Peru, this is like 20 years ago or so, 20 plus years ago. And the landing gear wouldn't come down. This was a jet. And so we came down without a wheel. And then I did get to, slide down the yellow chute.
Oh my, I haven't had that. I have had the, we're just about to land and all of a sudden they mysteriously accelerate and take off again. And you're like, what happened there? The only thing that I can think of is that, somebody forgot to put down the landing gear or that it didn't deploy correctly.
I do think that GenAI, though, is not a plane you'd want to get in completely. I don't think there's 100% confidence in that. And I don't think there should be for certain use cases because hallucinations. And I think one way someone deals with that. So a lot of my conversations with clients when it comes to GenAI and that is about that risk management techniques. right? So if you're using the output of GenAI, for example, to communicate with a customer, A/B test it, right? You can use different methods, just like they do with websites. Just like, every website that Amazon serves isn't the same website. They're constantly testing it. So the test and learn I think is even more important in these use cases.
Mm. Personally, I feel like we should be including this in responsible AI. That responsible AI, at the end of the day, what is it should be doing? It is ultimately about risk management, and risk management has all of those benefits of adoption and everything else. It's encouraging to see that the federal government in the U.S. side seems to be occasionally coming around to that, and they focus very heavily on the NIST AI risk management framework, and so it's wonderful to see that they seem to be promoting that as a key idea. But I don't hear folks always referring to it as a responsible AI to be about, at the end of the day, manage risk, manage business risk, as well as legal and ethical and societal risk. But should we?
Well, definitely it's about risk management. Yes, but this is more sophisticated than software, because software has a risk too, right? There's huge testing, regression testing and everything, yet there's still bugs, right? Yet software still has bugs. So everyone in software kind of accepts that there's going to be bugs. So you have to accept that in AI as well. But in AI, it may, in some cases, be more difficult to understand where those are coming from, because you don't have access to how it was trained or necessarily all the code. So that's where risk mitigation becomes more sophisticated. But you know what? A lot of financial services companies, they'll do champion challenger, they'll do A/B testing, as I said, because there's risk even in any model. That is perhaps predictive of something in the future. So yes, risk management, absolutely. But it's not that far in a concept to insurance companies and financial services and a lot of other companies. So the AI leader has, I would say, needs to become familiar with that.
It sounds like there's a lot of value in actually doing risk assessments early on when you're scoping projects and prioritizing projects, to go in and take that into account, because like for Gen AI, far easier to go after, or far more likely to be successful with use cases where there is a certain amount of risk tolerance.
And this is where it's more difficult to be an air traffic controller, because right, you're controlling planes that may not do what you tell it to do. so there's going to have to be an approach that's a little bit more.
So it depends on how obedient your pilots are. If you're in an organization with very disobedient pilots, you might have a hard time, because they might be very intent on. I'm reminded of Burma Airways, which I flew on a couple of times as a kid, and they would hire former fighter pilots, and apparently that caused a couple of crashes when that plane, the passenger planes do not behave the same way as the fighter jets. Love to tackle the question of cost and value. I mean, we all know the importance of measure value, quantify it, go in and be constantly messaging that in order to ensure the success and longevity of your role. That holds for the AI leader. I mean, that holds for, I think, the data science leader and everybody else involved here. But do they need to be thinking about measuring value differently? But I think the cost side is new, in that previously the costs of AI were pretty minimal. They were largely data scientists and the talent that you were putting at it, and your investments in your data platforms, which we're doing anyway. Now, all of a sudden, AI is a potentially giant cost center in its own right. Is there differences in how AI leaders should be thinking about value or cost?
Well, I mean, calculating the value is fundamentally a financial activity that's the same. What's different, though, is that there are different variables, right, that are that have different tolerances. So on the cost side, especially, right, and if you're doing a project, you're hypothesizing the business value of this. And I say hypothesizing because you may not know whether or not you have signal in the data to actually be successful with this project until you actually try to train a model to see if it has signal that, has predictive power. So I think when budgeting for AI, there has to be more of a tolerance for experimentation, because every use case isn't necessarily a sure thing compared to, say, software, where you're doing a new, we're going to add these new features to our customer mobile app. Okay, so I've got the requirements document. It's like I'm building a house. I'm going to need all this stuff and I can build it. Yes, I'm going to go over, because a lot of software projects go over cost, but I can get it done, right? Whereas in certain data science projects, not all, but some data science projects, you may have to go do half of the job or a third of the job before you know if you can do the rest of the job and abandon it. So getting back to the portfolio, you have to take more of a portfolio approach to choosing use cases. Choose 6 use cases, maybe 2 will be successful. So I think there's a different view there. Now, having said that, because this stuff has been around for 10 years plus, GenAI is newer, you can pick use cases in your industry that other companies were successful at. You probably have the same data and can be successful. So the risk to implementing it is lower.
You're reminding me of that talk I got to give years ago at Forrester about the 7 habits of highly effective AI supervillains, where I think was the third habit was steal. Go in and fast follow successes that other folks in your industry have been successful with, and that and even outside of your industry. There's imitation is the highest form of flattery, right?
Yeah. And I would avoid moonshots, because we haven't been back to the moon since 70 something. So it must be a lot harder than we think.
Yeah, indeed. It's not quite a moonshot, but thinking about the future and future proofing generally. So there's obviously rapid technological change. Every couple of weeks, there's an entirely new slew of models on the GenAI side of things. And certainly new solutions that are coming on board daily, and a good number of scientific breakthroughs. But also on the regulatory side, again, very fast movement when it comes to new AI regulations, especially on the European side, but on the US side, very likely at the state and municipal level, if not maybe even some on the federal level. Is there ways in which the AI leader should be thinking about how they can future-proof the organization towards these changes, both on the AI technology side and on the regulation side?
Yeah, so I think on the regulation side, I mean, it's hard to predict exactly what that will mean. I think it's terrible for the world to have regulations on what amounts to mathematics and software. And also language, words, strings of words coming out of so there's all kinds of implications there, but nevertheless, there will be regulations and enterprises will have to deal with it. I actually think the best equipped organizations, and so if you're an AI leader and you don't come from a regulatory background, you've got world experts in your organization. If you're in financial services, healthcare, insurance, these are highly regulated industries already, and they have dozens, if not hundreds, of compliance people who are so I would tell a leader, look, meet with your compliance people. They may not be experts in AI. They're probably coming up to speed on it, though, and what it means from a regulatory. But this is probably not something you have to do yourself. And they've been used to dealing with regulations and some of the techniques. So get your knowledge from people who've dealt with regulations for a long time. Because, Kjell, when you look at the regulations, they're not that different Many of them are similar to things that are already illegal or already regulated, but with an AI stamp on it. Maybe 80% of these things aren't even new.
Well, I think it probably also goes to go and, if you can, talk to the data scientists and the analytics teams that are in financial services and see what they do. What are the validation steps that they conduct, and what are the capabilities that they have around governance and tracking and monitoring that they have in place. But probably with the idea that to see how you can do it a lot faster and more efficiently, because I've yet to meet a financial service organization which hasn't complained about the friction, the time and effort that it takes. So if you can go in and build more automation into that, so you can do it faster, the better.
And do you agree that many of these are sort of already on the books? Like, for example, people immediately say, "Oh, well, we don't want this to, be biased in a social bias, or you already can't do that. You already can't do it. Or we don't want you to use customer data. Well, you already can't do that without permission in certain jurisdictions." So it's like, okay, you could put AI in front of that. That's fine. So you may already know
to a certain extent, those are the best regulations where you're fairly technology agnostic, when you are mostly going in and saying that, well, fraud is illegal, and versus fraud with AI is prohibited, right? I mean, that doesn't, and especially when you don't have a very good handle on what a lot of the use cases are yet, it becomes very difficult and very risky. You're much more likely to overregulate or misregulate.
Yeah, and I think the one thing people are concerned with is like the scale of it, though, right? Because one argument that I've heard is like, oh yes, but like deep fakes are already illegal. Like you can't, create a video using any means that defraud certain, for fraudulent purposes. But yeah, you can make an argument that with some of this GenAI stuff, you could just like do this at scale. But you could also say, well, that's more of an enforcement.
Yes. And how you design the regulation. What is the penalty? Is it an effective penalty? And is it written in a way that there's the legislation written in a way that it can be enforced? Just because you have a law doesn't mean that it can be used, as we've witnessed so far with that New York AI in hiring law, where it doesn't seem to have been written in a way that is actually enforceable or implementable. So whether or not it's good or bad doesn't matter. It's a useless piece of regulation. So it seems. We'll see how that
goes. But nevertheless, it's something that companies will have to deal with. But I think my point is that most large organizations already are dealing with this. So it's for them, I think it's going to be seen as incremental. And if you're an AI leader and you seek out those people, they'll tell you how to think about this and where there's overlap and what they're already doing, because you're going to have to bring that down to your teams. And I wonder also if the vendors, AI platform vendors, will, I'm sure they will respond to market needs. So if there are some AI regulations that kind of become firm, the vendors are going to add features for auditing and whatever would help facilitate staying in compliance. There'll be features on a platform to help do that.
Yes, you might want to take a look at an AI ML platform that is already heavily used by heavily regulated industries, and take a look at the capabilities that they've been building out there in order to support those industries with their compliance needs. Not mentioning any specific vendor there whatsoever. No, none. Well, Mike, thank you very, very much for your time and thoughts on this. In terms of your latest research that you've got coming out, I believe there is a wave on foundation models coming out soon, and obviously the AI ML platforms landscape. Are those the reports that folks should be looking at?
Well, so one thing we didn't talk about is the infrastructure side of this, and I have a Forrester wave coming out, the AI infrastructure. It's coming out on March 18th. This is the hardware side of it, right? So it's got hardware manufacturers, but also has the hyperscalers. But the focus isn't on the software platform, but on running the workloads, right? So that's coming out. We are starting an AI foundation model wave. I don't know what the shelf life of it's going to be, but customers are demanding it, so we're doing it, and then later we'll do the AI platform wave.
Very exciting, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kjell.
Hello, and thank you, folks, for joining us. I've been answering some of the questions as we go along, but if you do have additional questions, please do feel free to put them either under the Q&A or in the chat. I do want to call out some of the wonderful questions that we've gotten so far and the comments that we've gotten so far. For example, this one from Alexander Heidinger talking about responsible AI and legal compliance and how important that is for the AI leader, and who that AI leader should be. So to the degree that you have a CDAO which is responsible for your AI and machine learning projects, which has the mandate to be going in and taking the lead there, which has resources and capabilities around it, that is a wonderful place to put that responsibility. In some organizations, the CDO, for either historical reasons or just where they are or the mandate or other things like that, isn't really in that role, in which case there are plenty of other leadership roles that have emerged in order to be the person who ultimately takes responsibility for legal compliance and responsible AI generally. I guess the most extreme example of this is the US executive order, which has mandated that every federal agency needs to have a chief AI officer. And in those cases, again, that is a likely home for who should own responsible AI. Other great questions and comments to call out. I think Jody A. from Bloomberg had a great one as well. She was saying that, well, the responsibility of data science for GenAI is the practice of experimentation, ongoing monitoring, and being in charge of the importance of data quality. And that's absolutely true. But often the actual role tends to be a lot more intense than that. It often tends to go all the way from understanding the business problem and identifying the requirements, going in and decomposing the problem into its component parts, and designing the solution and the pipeline around it. So one of the things with generative AI is the degree to which these pipelines are usually a lot more complex than the ones that we have traditionally seen on the machine learning side, and in terms of the machine learning models that are embedded in software, because you often end up with upstream models, embedding models, you end up with new technologies like vector stores in there, you end up with leveraging RAG and doing a lot in the way of creating real prompt templates and obviously lots of prompt engineering. But you often end up decomposing the problem into some predictive ML models upstream, and then sometimes multiple LLMs downstream. And so who is it who often is the person best, or usually is the only person who is well suited to going in and designing all of that? Unfortunately, it tends to be the data scientist. Are they trained on this? Often not, but again, it is so similar to the regular role of practicing jobbing data scientists that they end up being in that position. Other great questions that came in were like, well, just how do I choose between when I can leverage an externally hosted model and when I need to either host my own or fine tune it or do training. And there's a lot of different factors that you take into that have to be taken into account over here. Certainly for some of our financial services customers and on the government customers, they just don't have any choice but to host it internally. The policies are just very strict about being able to leverage a third-party model, and so they are standing up their own internal models and making those available. But then we have folks on the pharma side where they are going in and hosting and fine-tuning their own models, but for a very, very different reason. Yes, there might be some data security reasons in there as well, but above all, it's because they are looking to go in and use these models in a very, very different different way than most folks are using LLMs. Right? They're taking a language model and fine-tuning it with molecular data to go in and predict the response of a peptide to a particular molecule in order to go in and identify new treatments for heart disease or diabetes or colorectal cancer and things along those lines. And there, you're not going to be leveraging a third-party model for that. This is something which you are massively fine-tuning. This is something which is extraordinarily core to your intellectual property, to your business. It's going to be the foundation of your competitiveness. You're not going to go in and leverage an off-the-shelf model for that. It's just not going to work. But also, you're going to want to have something that you want to really, really control there. So I see a lot of folks taking the approach that, they're going to try with an externally hosted model and see how far they get and see whether or not it meets their performance requirements, see how much it costs. And then when they'll compare that with an internally hosted model and see what the differential is. And but trying to use the externally hosted ones and to do as little fine tuning as possible until it's absolutely necessary. But I should say, really, you do want the capability to go in and test all of these. You want the ability to test multiple externally hosted models. You want the ability to stand up your own internal models to go in and see how they perform relative to those based on performance, accuracy, hallucinations, cost, and so on. And often you find yourself that, well, in order to get the kind of performance that I need, I will need to go in and fine tune. And often that's because of key differences in how the model you're wanting to use the model versus how the models were thought of in the general audience for them. So, for example, seeing examples from the U.S. military going in and training their own, or certainly fine-tuning their own large language models because the language of the military is very different, or hearing from telecommunications companies in other countries where they're looking to go in and use this LLM for other languages, and finding that the open source ones definitely not doing a great job in languages other than English, but even the proprietary ones, they're better for in non-English languages, but often not good enough, and then finding themselves needing to go in and do that. Was just at a talk by the Norwegian Public Transportation Office going in and training their own models because the models out there were not really good enough when it comes to Norwegian. Other great questions in here. Let me just go and check. And there was a wonderful question in here, which is very difficult to answer around, just what should I be keeping in mind when it comes to, this is from Dipankar, what should I be keeping in mind when it comes to designing AI models and data engineering platforms and the pipelines to ensure that the systems are well integrated? And it would be wonderful if there was an easy answer in there other than just saying like everything's important. But what I guess I would say is I would go back to not viewing this as like a simple API call, because that's often the temptation is, oh, well, it's an externally I can use an externally hosted model and I'll just plug it in and it'll work. And that can work for completely undifferentiated use cases like code generation with GitHub Copilot, or very ad hoc search and summarization use cases. Sure, yeah. If you are going in and just really doing the equivalent of enabling folks to access ChatGPT, yeah, then there's very little that you need to do there, comparatively speaking. It's not super easy. There are issues to take into account, but the key thing is that for actual Gen AI applications and use cases, that's almost never the case, right? I mean, yes, we will all be using Copilot for code generation, and folks will be using things like ChatGPT and equivalents for ad hoc querying, generation, and so on. But for your organization, for your digital transformation initiatives, for what you're doing, that is going to drive competitiveness and in long term, that is going to require creating a GenAI application, a GenAI pipeline that is going to be very complex, and that's going to include a bunch of different technologies. I mean, for example, an embedding model to go in and create those features vectors that you're putting into your vector store, going in and often leveraging a upstream predictive model, as I was saying. So for things like customer service automation, that upstream model might be doing next best action prediction. It's one of those things where, yes, you can do next best action prediction with an LLM. It's just not very accurate. It's more costly. It's slower. And often, if you do it in an upstream model that you host, then you don't have to worry about passing customer data to an external, to a third-party hosted LLM. So you'll often have an upstream predictive model, potentially multiple downstream LLMs that you're calling and potentially doing consensus on, and then running through guardrails. And so all of a sudden, the orchestration of this becomes a lot more complex than anybody is really expecting. Certainly anybody's expecting on the software side. We've seen it already. We're a little bit more used to that on the MLOps side of things, but it is at an increased level of complexity where the orchestration of the different components is just as important and a key challenge as is, just accessing the LLM on its own. So that's a key thing that I would leave you with. Although it does kind of bring me to a comment that Alexander Heidinger had at the end, which was, at the end of the day, MVP, test, learn, and adapt. And this is very much a situation where this is an emerging technology. These are emerging use cases, and it is extraordinarily important to be able to be extremely iterative with these. And so treating this like a more traditional software engineering project where you can define the requirements up front and try and tackle it in a waterfall approach really is extraordinarily difficult here, because the requirements are often unknown, the capabilities of the technology are unknown, the architecture is often unknown, and and certainly the way that it's going to perform is often completely undetermined and impossible to determine a priori. So, I mean, don't despair. Companies have done incredible things despite that uncertainty. But being able to start small, go in and identify the low-hanging fruit, and develop, test, continuously improve it, does incredible things and can be is very successful. I mean, it's what you have to do in this space. But as I think mentioned in the comments, to the degree that you can set yourself up for some kind of virtuous cycle where you're delivering value in stages, where you don't have to get everything right up front. In GenAI, as in with every AI and machine learning technology, that is a very tried and true pathway to success. So obviously recommend that. I think call out to Gerline's, my apologies for the pronunciation of your name, comment about trust and the importance of explainability, and how it's often it's annoying and it's difficult, but it's needed in order to drive trust. And completely agree with that if you are able to provide explainability in a way that you can show to an end user, it can be a wonderful way of driving trust. The problem is that often, even if you are able to, you leverage an explainability technique, often the results from that are just so confusing that it's not really intuitively understandable, and your end user doesn't really end up trusting that anything more, and they've just gotten confused, and sometimes trust this even less. So explainability is powerful when it works out for you. It is necessary for going in and just validating your models, right? I mean, it's a great tool as a data scientist to use things like Lyman Sharp on the predictive side, for example, to just go in and be able to see whether or not your models are overfitting or whether or not there's spurious correlations involved. Those are supremely useful ways of ensuring that your model is not falling into some very obvious errors. So yes, use explainability when you can. The problem is you very rarely sufficient. Almost invariably, you're going to be needing to tackle this on multiple dimensions, multiple methods, but also be going in and putting in place the people and the processes to ensure that kind of trust and safety and responsible AI generally. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Kjell.Carlsson@dominodatalab.com, but also it goes without saying to my colleagues, we would love to hear from you. If you have very strong differences in opinion, we'd love to hear from you even more. Please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of help. You probably would also be interested in the white paper, which is on the Domino website on responsible generative AI. Thank you very, very much for your time, and we appreciate you joining us.